Welcome to JCATS, a program that seeks to introduce Japanese contextualized literature and ideas for use by missionaries and anyone that seeks to share the gospel with Japanese people.
日本人から聞く日本のキリスト教。
Hey, welcome back to JCats. This is John. Hope your summer's going well. It's really hot in Tokyo again, but that's cool. I think personally I prefer it being too hot rather than too cold. I'd rather it be 30 degrees Fahrenheit than 30 degrees Celsius. I thought that was a fair way of presenting the question, but it might actually be a little biased toward the warm. I think a lot of people might prefer 30 Celsius. How about this? I'd prefer 35 Fahrenheit to 35 Celsius. No, the opposite. I'd prefer 35 Celsius to 35 Fahrenheit, right? That's a little bit more of a fair question because 35 is really hot and 30 is just like kind of hot. Yeah. Sorry, I got a little cold. Please bear with me. Anyway, last time we talked about Nihonkyo. I thought that was a very cool topic. I'm very excited about it. And part of the reason that I'm very excited about it is between the time I was told about the videos that I reviewed or explained in my last episode about Nihonkyo, between the time that I received those links and then watched the videos, I was at camp and I was reading another book. My goal was being away from my kids for 2 weeks at camp. Though I was actually with other people's kids most of the time, I could spend, like evenings, like after lights out or whatever, I could read, or whenever I could. I would read this other book that I have had for years, since like 2021 or something. I bought in the Ginza Christian bookstore. I think there's a Kyodan bookstore in Ginza. I found this book. I'll just for those of you who are watching on YouTube, this really cool like old painting of Kannon. The like Hotoke Buddhist like goddess kind of person that everybody likes over here. The book is called Understanding Japaneseness. A fresh look at Nipponjinron through maternal filial affection by Kosuke Nishitani, who is a pastor and scholar taught at Aoyama Gakuin, I believe, which is a very famous university in Japan, Wesleyan roots. And he wrote a book, that was kind of like the Nihonkyo topic, but expanded. So, Nishitani's premise, he's sort of exploring the same ideas of Nihonkyo, but again, he, instead of Nihonkyo would be like Yamamoto Chie, mostly his Nihonjinron. Okay, so think of Nihonjinron as maybe more of a non-copyrighted way of saying something like cola, and maybe like Nihonkyo is kind of like Yamamoto Shichihei's like Coca-Cola. Makes sense? So what Nishitani is basically saying in his book is that there was sort of like a Nihonkyo or Nihonjinron boom post World War II, where a number of Japanologists posited their thoughts on what makes a person Japanese, or what do all Japanese people do, right? So the Nihonkyo that I talked about in the last episode is largely based on the work of Yamamoto Chie, also known as Isaiah Ben Dasan. And if you want the joke about the name, go ahead and listen to the last episode. I think my mom said that my nieces appreciated that one. Anyway, before I continue, I wanted to share an opportunity with everyone, all of you, who listen to this show or watch the show. In August, I'm going to give you the time. It's going to be in Japan time. It's August 17th from 11 a.m. until 1 p.m. So I believe that would be if you're on the West Coast, California, Seattle, Oregon, Pacific Standard Time or Daylight Savings Time. I believe that would be August 16th, which is a Friday, like 7 to 9 p.m. The author of, I will display the book for our YouTube guys, Japanese Understanding of Salvation, Soteriology in the Context of Japanese Animism. If you can see this, it took me forever before somebody finally told me that character in the last name, it looks like a weird B, is like a double S, because this is a German guy. Martin Heiswolf wrote this book. When I had my little booth, my little JCats booth at Gemma Connect in Tokyo in February, which is Gemma's a great group that networks evangelical missionaries with each other. I do some stuff with Gemma. I like Gemma. I think Gemma's cool. If you're an evangelical missionary in Japan, more likely than not, you're a Gemma member. Martin Heiswolf was a Gemma member and a missionary in Japan for a number of years, and then he did a doctorate. I think it was at the University of South Africa, or at least it was at a university in South Africa, where he looked at the Japanese idea of salvation through a lot of through Shinto, through oral tradition, and so it's published by Langham, which is, to my understanding, is a really good Christian academic publisher that focuses on work that would originate in the majority world, not North America or Europe. But even so, there's very little stuff that gets published directly in English that relates to Japanese theology. And so Dr. Heiswolf, actually contacted him to see if he wouldn't mind talking about his book on this podcast. And instead, we're going to do a full, a seminar on August 17th in person at the Ochanomizu Christian Center, online through Zoom if you are unable to come to Tokyo. And I think I'll try to get the information up on the I'll try to get the recording on the podcast or the YouTube after the fact, but I think it'd be really cool if anybody would like to come. I will put the link to the flyer, which has an RSVP link on that link, in the YouTube show notes, and then the podcast show notes, as well as I know how to do those things. And if you would like to attend, we'd love to have you. Okay, so you can either attend in person if you're in Tokyo, or you can attend through Zoom. Okay, end of advertisement. And now back to your regularly scheduled programming with understanding Japaneseness. All right, so Nihonjinron. Ron is like theory, right? So like kind of like Japanology. So last time we talked about Nihonkyo, that would be like Japanism. And then today we're going to talk about like Japanology, but he calls it in English Japaneseness. It's fine, right? Japaneseness. I like Japanology better, but Japaneseness. The book's going to start. He gives you a little rundown of the history of Nipponjinron, his own. Then he moves on to his perspectives on Nipponjinron, his being the author, doctor, pastor, teacher, writer, Kosuke Nishitani. And then I think some things that how the Japaneseness sort of colliding with democracy, what I guess expectations of living in a secular society, a free society, talking about human rights, religious plurality, and then he moves on. Encountering Nipponjinron in chapter 3 is where he starts talking about organ transplants. I thought that's where things really were like, oh wow, this is interesting. So if I'm going to try and so he talks about organ transplants. That's sort of like his initial interest in Nipponjinron and Japaneseness as a study. So basically, what he's saying about organ transplants is that although Japan is a like an advanced society, they really are behind most societies in the world when it comes to organ transplants. That's specifically transplants from dead people to living people. And what's interesting is it's not because of any sort of superstition about uncleanness of like recently deceased bodies being used and pieces putting into like it's nothing like that. So basically the reason that Japanese people or the Japanese medical world or whatever tends to lag behind other developed countries in, I think he's talking about liver transplants. No, that's next. In organ transplants is because Japanese people feel weird about getting something so significant from a stranger, about receiving a gift, as it were, at that level from a stranger, allowing themselves to be obliged, to become obligated to a stranger or perhaps the deceased organ donor's family, even though maybe they would never actually meet the deceased organ donor family, right? But the idea of receiving a gift that significant and being unable to repay it seems to be the reason why Japanese are not enthusiastic about organ transplants. The other reason seems to be that the idea of like attempting to lengthen your life in a somewhat unnatural way is also seen as sort of a like bad, right? It's like kind of odious to sort of cling on to life beyond your natural years. Okay, so the sort of double thing there. But this leads us into or back into some of Yamamoto's stuff. Again, Yamamoto was the guy that wrote about the Japanese and the Jews. But we'll get there. We'll get back there. Okay. The contrast that Nishitani brings up is that I think it's liver transplants are much more common in Japan, and the thought is that is because most liver transplants, rather than going from one, like from a dead person to an unknown living person, they are mostly coming from blood relatives, or what Nishitani is calling quasi-blood relations. So I think that would be like marriage. Like a liver donor, a fit for a liver donor would be someone, A, willing to give you, I think, part of their liver, and B, generally close to you in blood. But marriage works too. I mean, in that sense, I guess anybody could work, but seeing as it's from a live person, there's some risk to the live person. But because the donor is most often blood or quasi-blood relation to the receiver of the organ, the liver, the part of the liver, because I guess with livers you can do like a half thing, like a starfish thing, and like you got 2 new livers at the end in a successful transplant. Now, if you guys realize that what I'm saying is stupid, then just replace the word liver with whichever organ in your body that works with. Maybe it's kidneys. I don't know. Like the starfish organ. You know what I'm saying, though? Like the organ that you can take half of and then put it in a new guy. And a successful transplant would mean that you've now got like fully regrown organs in both of the guys. So that kind of transplant you see a lot more of in Japan, because the obligation it's more acceptable to be obliged to a family member than it is to a stranger. Okay, so that was like, oh, hey, now you got my attention. So yeah, after Nishitani talks about organ transplants, he moves into how that specific example sort of shows one person's Nihonjinron, and that person is the aforementioned Yamamoto, Nihonkyo. So again, Yamamoto's Nihonkyo is kind of like a name brand version of a Nihonjinron. Like a Nihonjinron is like a car, right? And Nihonkyo is like a Toyota. I don't know. That's kind of how I understand it. Gosh, if somebody like, if I could like talk to the author about this stuff, that'd make more sense to me. But I think that's kind of how it is. Anyway, the videos that I was looking at, the Matarise Shodabo videos, were emphasizing Nihonkyo's emphasis on kuki yomu, right? That's in here a little bit. Nishitani wants to talk about Yamamoto's thoughts on again, on being obligation. Yep, obligation. So I put this in my I put this in my my prayer like support update. I just in passing I just mentioned this concept called Fabianian on. It didn't explain it. Sometimes I put that kind of thing at like close to the bottom of my prayer letter just to see how many people are actually like reading my prayer letters. But some people do. One person replied and was like, "What's Fabianian on?" And I was like, "Oh man, yeah, somebody read it." So anyway, Nishitani talks about Fabianian on. So what that is for Nishitani, Fabianian on is Yamamoto's, at least one of Yamamoto's major contributions to the Nihon Japaneseness discussion. So who's Fabian? That's where the Fabianian comes from. Fabian, as explained, I think in chapter 4 here, maybe 5, 4 or 5, something like that. Yeah, 4 of Nishitani's book. I think it was Xavier or someone in the very early Catholic missionary community, when that was still legal, and the Jesuits were sort of building steam in Japan. One of their converts, a Japanese convert, whose Japanese name is unknown, lost to history, I guess, but his Catholic name, his Christian name was Fabian. He wrote a few works that were, I think, meant to help Jesuit priests from Europe to learn the Japanese language and also to learn about Japanese thought. So he's like a Nihonkyo or Nihonjinron guy, like 400 years ago, which is pretty cool, I think. And what he did is he rewrote, I guess, or wrote in English for the Jesuit priests, the tale of Heike. I don't know. I've always read it like it's an English word, so I always said Heike. But that's, now that I think about it, that's probably wrong. So like, it's Heike, right? I don't think I've ever seen it in Japanese, or if I have, I didn't recognize it with the kanji. Anyway, the theme of like Fabian's understanding of on comes through in his like retelling of the tale of Heike, I guess, Heike. Again, just working 2 different languages here. Well, what I thought was really interesting was this Fabian guy actually became like apostate. He like, after essentially working for the Jesuits for a number of years, went ahead and started writing stuff that was like anti-Christian. And one of the things that he emphasized in his obligation is that it's imperative to see people as people. That's one of the sort of obligations, is to treat people with respect, I guess. And he felt that the Western Jesuits here were not looking at Japanese as people, which I think that missionaries even today can accidentally do that, in the sense that like we could be looking at people as like objects for work. If your job is to proselytize, and it's kind of what missionaries' jobs are, then it becomes easier and easier to see the people that you are trying to reach as objects instead of as people. I think that was something that this Fabian guy didn't feel very good about. Yeah, I could just read. Let's see. It says right in the book, page 68, according to Yamamoto, Fabian's abandonment of Christianity was due neither to his fear of persecution nor to his dissatisfaction with the prospects of being promoted in the church as suggested by Fukushima. Rather, as Yamamoto suggests, Fabian's
abandonment of Christianity was purely the result of his own thought process. And then, he wrote these books like Against, Ha Daisu, Ha meaning like against, and Daisu is the katakana for Deus, God, like the Latin. So, he was not into the lack of humility, too arrogant to regard the Japanese as persons, was a quote from Fabian. There's 4 kinds of obligations: one from heaven, one from the king, one from parents, and one from one's own people. So, this is gonna look. I'm not gonna make like a 4-hour video here. I'm trying to keep it reasonable. What I thought for me was like, in a sense, the most important page in the Nishitani's book, his Nihonjinron, is page 84, where he sort of lays out his framework. He says that it seems like kind of probably as a result of the emperor declaring in the wake of the defeat in World War II that he is not, in fact, a god, that sort of actually had maybe more constitutional implications than it would seem. Anyway, that breaking of kuki, as it were, allowed a number of thinkers to say, well, if that's not who we are as Japanese, then who are we as Japanese? And a number of thinkers put forth their Nihonjinrons, including Yamamoto, though. His work is pulled, it's not like so much that he's got like a single concise volume about his Nihonkyo. It's sort of scattered through some of his stuff. But Yamamoto is the first one that Nishitani goes through in depth. But he says we must also consider several other important perspectives, including, these include, besides Yamamoto's Fabianian concept of on. Okay, so that's one. Because for me, it's easier to like see these in categories. So he lists 6, okay? The 1, Yamamoto Fabianian on, obligation. Okay. 2, Doi's concept of Amae. Okay. Takeo Doi, world famous psychologist, is this one. Sorry, podcast guys. I love you the most. I love podcasts. I don't really care for YouTube videos, but I couldn't show you the book title there. It's the anatomy. I have the English version. The Anatomy of Dependence by Takeo Doi, the key analysis of Japanese behavior. Doi is saying, gosh, I can't give a due justice to a one-line definition here. Basically, the way that a parent indulges a child, and also sort of keeps a child in the parent's debt, I suppose. So let's just leave it at that. Amae can be translated, and is often translated dependence. It's sometimes translated pampering. The Anatomy of Dependence by Takeo Doi. That's the second like Nipponism. Shoot. Yeah. Or Nihonjinron, Japanology, if you will. That Nishitani mentions. The third one is Arimasa Mori. Here's his book. His book is Keiken to Shiso, Experience and Thought. Haven't gone through this one yet. Just got it. It's going to take me some time. But thankfully, Nishitani explains. Nishitani's going to explain each of these in his own book, so you don't actually have to go out and buy each other guy's book, which is like hard to find, 50 years later, used copies and stuff. Arimasa, Morty's concept is the second person relation. This is a good one. Basically, the way I understood it is Japanese like to be NPCs. It's like, so an NPC, if you're playing a computer game, like a role-playing game or a tabletop role-playing game, a pen and paper role-playing game. So an example of a role-playing game was like Zelda. I'm just trying to be as like broadly friendly for especially missionaries who are my age and older, or older than me. If you don't know what Zelda is, it's a Nintendo game where you run around and you talk to people and then you do stuff. An NPC is a non-player character. It is a character that is a computer that the player interacts with. Its purpose is to provide information or something for the actual human player. Okay, so a non-player character exists to sort of help the player move along in the story. So what do I mean when I say Japanese like to be NPCs? That sounds really offensive. So shoot, I hope I can explain this. But that was just the way I said it in my mind. That was not the way Nishitani said it. Or I assume that Mori said it because he probably said it before there were any kind of role-playing games. Certainly before Dungeons and Dragons. The second person relation is like, it was discussed by Mori, but it was also discussed by Yamamoto. I think Nishitani just thought Mori explained it better or more thoroughly or earlier than Yamamoto, but Yamamoto also goes through this second person relation concept. Basically, that it's probably more comfortable for a Japanese person to be the person in front of them's you. So you're you. Like Bill wants to be Ted's you more than be Bill. Like it's comfortable, right? So you're almost putting yourself in the position of like, how can I make Ted a happy customer? How can I help out Ted with the thing that he's working on? Then we'll both be happy. I think that's kind of the gist of the your you. It's like omae no omae in some of this writing. That I think of it, I'm gonna need to definitely. I mean, that's why I've got all these. That's why I've got all these like sticky notes all over and highlights all over and annotations all over, so I can understand this stuff better. I'm gonna review it more, but I think that's kind of what they're getting at with the your you concept. And a lot of the Keigo and Son Keigo, the honorific language, I think feeds into that. You can really be the person in front of the person in front of you by using proper weighted or proper tiered language. You say the right words as the lower person, you say the right words as the higher person. I think that's the third of the 6 concepts. Again, Fabianian, on, obligation, Amae, dependence, and then this second person relation. The fourth one that Nishitani mentions is the vertical society idea, by Chie Nakane. Here's her big book, Japanese Society. And here's her English big book, because this is translated from Japanese and has a slightly different, But her big book in English would be Japanese Society. And she's talking about vertical relationships. I think I haven't dug deep into that. I think that's like your Joge Kanke stuff. That means like your upperclassmen, lowerclassmen, big brother, little brother, higher ranking employee, lower ranking employee, father son, subject king, etc. Okay, that's the fourth. The fifth, and I honestly I had trouble distinguishing the fifth from the second set, because it seems like it's the same thing to me, and I'll let you know what I mean by this first set and second set in a second here. Kawai Hayao's maternal society concept, another psychologist. Maternal society compared to paternal societies. I'm going to skip that one for a second. I'll come back to it. The final of the 6 Nihonjinrons that Nishitani was interested in is Keigo Okonogi's version of the Ajase complex. The Ajase complex, which it's contrasted with Freud's, what is it, Oedipus like complex. So for Freud, it's like a young person defeats the monster and then gets the fair maiden, but for Freud, maybe the monster is like the father and the fair maiden's like actually the mother. Okay, so Okonogi's Ajase complex. All right. Had to pause, had to like look in my book for some of these terms. Okonogi's teacher was a guy named Kosawa, just so if you want to look it up, I don't know. So the sort of like actually the Kosawa Okonogi Ajase complex. Best to give you the story of Ajase first. Story time. Okay, so this is an Indian, like Indian, right? Story, a Buddhist story, retold by Kosawa and finished by Okonogi. So that's why it's the Kosawa Okonogi Ajase complex. There are A, B, C, D, E, F, I think 6 main plot points to this story. Ida Ike was the wife of Bimbishara, king of Magadha in ancient India, and Ajase was their son. That's point 1. Point 2, as Ida Ike came to fear losing Bimbishara's love for her because of her waning beauty as she was aging, she wanted to have his son, their successor, to secure her position. However, she was childless. Childless. I can speak. So she asked a fortune teller what to do. The fortune teller told her that a woodsman living nearby would die in 3 years. And after that, her son would be born. Ida Ike was happy to hear that she would have a son, but she did not want to wait 3 years, so she arranged for the woodcutter to be killed. The woodcutter then uttered a curse before dying that he would be reborn a prince that would kill his own father. Then he died. Ida Ike was believed to be pregnant, but according to the book here, carried a heavy anxiety toward the curse uttered by the hermit and the future enmity of Ajase toward her.
Her neurosis, as a result, was so great that she eventually dropped her baby Ajase, who miraculously was unharmed except for a broken finger. The name Ajase, which would have been Ajatasatru in Sanskrit, the meanings are combined. The meanings of broken finger and prenatal rancor are combined to create that name. Ajase grew into a wholesome youth, but was destined to kill his father. When he figured out what his mother had done, I guess that was why he killed his father. And then he imprisoned his mother, which then led him to have a deeply guilty conscience that resulted in a bad skin condition. During this time, no one would come near Ajase to nurse him because of his skin condition except his own mother. His mother is in anguish. She asks Buddha, I ask you, Buddha, why did I have such a bad son? What kind of sin did I commit in a previous incarnation? I thought that would have been kind of obvious to her with the whole woodcutter thing. The ensuing dialogue between Idaike and Buddha gave her an insight into her own conflict. When she applied this insight to how she cared for Ajase, the skin disease was also cured. Ultimately, he was regarded as a wise king of good repute. The end. That's the story. The sort of takeaways here, I think, are actually super not fun when it comes to trying to contextualize a gospel, because it shows you we got work to do. What we've got here in the book, it says, indeed, in the world of Idaike and Ajase, each one's sin is forgiven by the other based on their understanding of Buddhist teaching, namely that the causalities of their sins are so unlimited that both Idaike and Ajase are not in the position to be accused, but to be saved. So, unfortunately, the prevailing Japanese thought that we find coming out of the Ajase complex is, whose fault is it? Nobody's fault, or everybody's fault. There is an anecdote in this section by that refers to, like, I don't know if it's a movie or a comedy routine by Takeshi Kitano, Bito Takeshi, actor comedian. Apparently said something like, if we all cross the street when it's a red light, we're all safe. Like, if everybody's doing it together, then nobody's responsible. So I think what this is pointing out is that the whose fault is it when something goes wrong is very nebulous and gelatinous and difficult to pin down in Japanese thought. So if you're a Christian and you're ever trying to convince someone that they need to be forgiven, it can be very difficult to get them to feel like they have something definitely to be forgiven of. It can either be like, well, is it really my fault? Or, well, everybody does that, so is it really, like, why are you talking to me, you know? On the flip side, I thought one thing that was, like, positive that I highlighted, it says, one's sense of repentance, i.e. one's voluntary guilt feeling, is brought about through the forgiveness of the other against whom one has committed a sin. This simply could not be found in Freudian psychoanalysis. So what I was thinking of when I read that sentence and highlighted it was that maybe as Christians, the easier way to have someone sort of confronted by the reality of their need for salvation, aka their sinfulness, is pointing out that their sins are forgiven by the sacrificial work of Christ. And I think that also ties into the obligation thing, which from the obligation chapter said there's like there's no gifts, there's no gifts. It's interpersonal, like links through obligation. So in a sense, if a person first is like, oh, I don't need forgiveness, it's like, well, but somebody died for you, then they might be like, oh shoot, well then I'd better accept it, or something to that effect. I'm kind of just at this point, I'm just kind of trying to think through, because it's always so much easier to find problems. That's probably why Japan is 1% or less Christian, because there's a lot of problems between a typical Christian presentation and typical Japanese thought. Case in point, Okonogi Kosawa's Ajase complex. Okay, this is getting too long. I'm going to wrap it up. There's other good stuff in this book, but for Nishitani, those 6 different Nihonjinrons, again, they are as follows. Turn my page. Yamamoto's Fabianian on obligation, Takeo Doi's Amae, dependence, Arimasa Mori's second person relation concept, Chie Nakane's vertical society concept, Hayao Kawai's maternal society concept, and Keigo Okonogi's Ajase complex. I think these pair nicely. Yamamoto and Mori kind of pair together because Yamamoto sort of co-opted some of Mori's work. It seems like it could be that wasn't the case, but it seems like. So on obligation, Kuki, the like go with the flow stuff, and the second person relation, like the MPC idea, the you idea, like I'm the person in front of you, is more comfortable for me than I'm me, like who I am related to the person in front of me, who I am for you. That concept. Those two ideas seem to sort of pair up, I think. Doi and Okonogi were both like psychologists. I'm pretty sure they knew each other. Apparently Kosawa knew Doi pretty well, Kosawa being Okonogi's like teacher. So that's the Amae thing and the Ajase thing. Those seem to pair up pretty well. And then the vertical society and the maternal society concepts seem to pair up pretty well. The maternal society, it's kind of like, and I mentioned that's we're going to talk about that afterwards as its own thing. So the way that Nishitani talks about the whole idea of thinking about Japaneseness is like a grid. He said a number of let's call them Japanologists, named a bunch of things that they thought were unique for the Japanese people. So he separates them into X's and Y's. The 6 that I just mentioned for you are what Nishitani talks about as X's. X's are legitimate expressions of largely uniquely Japaneseness. Y's, he says, look, let's take things that people think are like uniquely Japanese, but they're not actually uniquely Japanese. We're not going to talk about them. We'll throw them out. They're the Y's. So we don't even talk about the Y's. The X's are the 6 that we just talked about. And then there's, I can't remember if it was Y or Z, but the other thing is the key to everything. Think of now, as I mix my metaphors pretty badly, think of your X's as your puppets. And then I think it's the Z actually, would be the hand in the puppets. For Nishitani, the hand in the puppets, the the point guard of the whole team here is the idea of maternal filial affection. In a good way, this is mothers taking care of you. In a bad way, this is mothers not allowing you to be independent ever. So in the worst case, he uses the idea of the Ouroboros, which I had to ask a bunch of kids, high school kids at camp, if they knew what an Ouroboros was. And wouldn't you know, one of them knew that an Ouroboros is a snake that's eating its own tail in that kind of infinity looking symbol. The bad guys use that for the symbol. James Earl Jones used that for the symbol in the Arnold Schwarzenegger Conan movie. For those of you who are into that sort of thing, I'm not. But that's sort of like the danger of a maternal society, whereas we won't even talk about the dangers of paternal societies because that's just not what we're talking about today. What Nishitani points out by the end of his book is that the problem of Japan, through his analysis of Japaneseness, is a lack of responsibility. Whose fault is it when something bad happens? Because eventually the top of the chain of command is the emperor, but the emperor is too well liked to be blamed for anything. Some of these ideas, the idea is that an ideal leader should be like well liked and not very smart, because the ideal leader is not really the one making decisions. He's more of a figurehead, and everybody likes the figurehead. And then the people who are pulling the strings behind the scenes would be just under the leader. Second in charge is actually the really in charge one type of situation. But that means eventually that anybody can claim sort of innocence in the case of something going poorly. And that lack of willingness to take responsibility, Nishitani calls the problem of Japaneseness. I thought that was cool because my whole point in studying all of this stuff is to find things, the questions the Japanese ask, that the answer is Jesus, right? So like the American question, the Western question that Westerners ask, that the answer is Jesus. And from a typically Protestant perspective, or probably Catholic as well, is who will absolve me from my guilt? Okay, I was reminded of a fun movie, and I just watched it for the first time since it was in theaters. Oh, Brother, Where Art Thou? The last time I saw that movie was when it was in the movie theater, and I watched it like 2 nights ago because two of my kids got baptized like a few weeks ago. It was really cool in a river, in the Tama River. And if you remember in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, which is a retelling of Homer's The Odyssey in like 1930s the South, there's a baptism scene where a bunch of people go down to the river. They're singing the Down to the River to Pray song, and one of George Clooney's henchmen, Delmar runs into the water to get baptized. He pops out of the water and he says, and I watched the video to quote this because it's fun. He says, "Well, that's it, boys. I've been redeemed. The preacher done washed away all my sins and transgressions. It's the straight and narrow from here on out, and heaven everlasting's my reward. The preacher said all my sins been washed away, including that Piggly Wiggly I knocked over in Yazoo. Neither God nor man's got nothing on me now. Come on in, boys. The water is fine." That's why Westerners, most often, not always, but most often, not that they rob grocery stores, but that the absolution of guilt that Jesus gives seems to be the main reason that people become Christians in Western places. Western people become Protestants or Catholics, right? The main reason, the original reason. That seems to be the reason that people offer in apologetics. Come to Jesus. He will absolve you of your guilt. That doesn't seem to be the question that Japanese are asking, that in general, that the answer is Jesus, who will absolve me of my guilt. What I found interesting in Nishitani's conclusion is that the Japanese problem is irresponsibility, not personal irresponsibility, but when something goes wrong in society or in a group, whose fault is it? It's no one's fault. It's no one's fault, and it's everyone's fault. Which I think can be answered if the question is tweaked a bit. Who will take responsibility for me? Could be a question. For my soul, for my life. If that's the question, then the answer could be Jesus, right? That could be an apologetic, I think, that sort of comes out of Nishitani's work here, in my mind. Maybe I'll check in with you next week or next time on this. This book by Nozomu Miyahira, who has published in English, who has published on Themelios of the Gospel Coalition. So he's definitely, cool with the evangelicals. I don't know, that's kind of all I know about him. This book is called Sekinin o Tori Imi o Ataeru Kami. Sekinin o Tori Imi o Ataeru Kami is the God who takes responsibility and gives meaning. So, I'll check it out. I think it's promising. Because, if Kuki, going back to Nihonkyo, which is sort of embedded in this, but this in Japaneseness. When we finish the Nihonkyo talk, the what now was Kuki can be broken. It's like the emperor has no clothes moment. When Kuki is broken, then big changes can happen. If the problem, as Nishitani sees it, of Japanese thought is irresponsibility, is that when something bad happens, no one is responsible. So essentially, deal with it. Gamon, right? If that's the problem, then maybe Kuki can be broken. The Kuki, in this case, being deal with it. Gamon. Everybody's the same. Everybody's got the same problem, so don't ask for a fix, right? If that Kuki can be broken by saying Jesus will take responsibility. Who takes responsibility for the breaking down of whatever? Jesus, right? In that sense, Jesus is the answer to that question. I think, I haven't thought about it enough to really flesh out a full deal for that, but I think that that's kind of the seed of a good apologetic for some, at least, Japanese. So anyway, getting long. Thanks for listening to the end, those of you who did.